take just a few minutes to explain the main purpose of the program is to obviously to bring closer together those who work on the alliance from the United States and Korea, and to improve and to enhance the understanding of these issues. The next meeting, it will take place on May 10th with the departing General, Commanding General Sharp on the 10th at the residence of Chairman Yoon, as some of you have may participated. We do look forward to continue to carry out this very important work through various fora, and also the participating members, Professor Lee Sang-mi, and also Vice President Lee Sang-han, Professor Lee Sang-hun, and of course my colleague Sang-hun Seok, and all of them have been very, very supportive of this program, along with Professor Mohan and Professor Koo. Just a very brief introduction about Professor Yoon, whom I know very well. He is currently Professor of International Political Economy at the Department of International Relations at Seoul National University, which is, as you know, the mecca of study on politics and diplomacy. He is recognized as one of the foremost experts on not only security and the hard issues of politics, but also in the issues of political economy, and oversees the development assistance. In fact, he's one of the very few scholars who published his work on Japanese ODA policy in a journal called World Politics, which is published by Princeton University, which is one of the most difficult, if not impossible, journals to publish. He's also served as Senior Vice President of the Korean Association of International Relations many years ago, I believe with Hyun Taek, the current Minister of Unification, and a few others. So the association is an extremely important academic, but also producer and a generator of future policymakers. He's also served as Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade in the year 2003 and 2004. He's, as I remember, extremely kind to scholars who are in need of a lot of help. Because if you're in the academia and you're trying to organize forums and forums, you tend to rely on your academic seniors. And I remember Professor Yoon, extremely busy, but always never not have had come to the breakfast or luncheon or dinner that we asked him with very short notice. So we are, and I'm very honored to have Professor Yoon today. And lastly, he's playing an extremely important role as a public diplomatic actor. I myself was in New York a few weeks ago, and I know that he's traveling all the time and meeting with different very high-ranking heads of states and those who are dealing with foreign policy, defending and explaining our position as a scholar diplomat. So without further ado, why don't we give a warm round of applause to Professor Yoon for being here. So today's lecture theme will be on the theme of denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. Is there an approach to resolving this very important issue? So why don't we have Professor Yoon for the lecture.
Thank you very much for your very kind and warm introduction, Professor Kim Byung-gi. It is my great pleasure to talk about this important issue for the distinguished participants. And thank you very much for inviting me to this important forum. And I'd like to express my deep appreciation to Vice President Lee Se-hang and also Professor Kim Byung-gi too. And as we all know, this is very difficult issue, difficult subject. I mean, denuclearization of North Korea. And frankly speaking, I'd like to make it clear that I do not aim to suggest a solution to this problem. Rather, I'd like to invite you to think about this issue and share wisdom with each other so that we can find some kind of better idea about how to approach to this difficult and complicated issue. As we all know, Cold War ended about 20 years ago, and through the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and German reunification in 1990. And political order global political order has changed significantly since that time. And some scholars say that this kind of change is as important as that of Congress of Vienna after the Napoleonic War in 1815, or conclusion of Versailles Treaty after the end of World War I, or something like that. So, collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of Cold War was definitely a big event, with very important implication for global order. The problem for Korean people is that we still live in the Cold War confrontational order in Korean Peninsula. As we all witnessed, there were provocations by North Koreans last year, attack on Yeonpyeong Island and attack on Kobe Cheonan. We all witnessed this kind of serious confrontation, provocation by North Korea. And despite this kind of confrontation continuing, I think that there has been some gradual but important changes going on inside North Korea. For example, despite the resistance of North Korean leaders, I think North Korean society has been experiencing some significant change toward the direction of marketization. That was mainly because of the lack of food and destruction of public distribution service in North Korea. So every North Korean had to find their own way of living, and they have become dependent on market mechanism nowadays for living. So it's an important change, and also the perception of North Korean people has changed a lot, and they recognize nowadays that South Koreans are living a much better life than they are doing nowadays. And they are familiar with Korean, South Korean dramas and singers and TV talents or something like that. And their perception of the world, outside world, has changed a lot. And though there will be no imminent political revolt or riots, I think this kind of change in the mindset of North Korean people will affect what will happen in the future. I don't know when that will be, probably 5 years later or 10 years later. Certainly, I think this kind of perception change of North Korean people will be there and will affect the events in future of North Korea. So I think this is the current period is a kind of transition period from Cold War confrontational order toward a post-Cold War Korea. Probably some kind of some type of more close integration between two political entities, South Korea and North Korea, or even a political unification sometime in the future. And I think the characteristics of the current inter-Korean relations can be described as, or characterized as having three types of inter-Korean imbalance. The first one is economic imbalance between the South and the North. As I already mentioned, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and Russia succeeded the Soviet Union. And Russia, since they pursued the goal of economic reform and they gave up their socialist system, they regarded North Korea no more as a friend country. So they ended their supply of energy and raw materials with non-market price. And because the price of energy rose up by 4 times or 5 times, actually the supply of oil from petroleum from Russia declined by 80% or something like that. Just 1/5 of previous petroleum supply was possible. So North Korean economy suffered severely due to this lack of energy resources. And the size of North Korean economy contracted by 50% between 1994 and 1999. And as we all know, food shortage caused by economic contraction and the failure in agricultural production led to mass starvation in the mid-1990s. And this led to the collapse of the public distribution system and the weakening of planned economy and socialist economy in North Korea. So that was the reality in the early 1990s and late 1990s too. But on the other hand, South Korea continued to enjoy its economic prosperity. And South Korean economy has become 30 times larger than North Korean economy. So there was a huge imbalance in terms of economic performance between the North and the South. And this imbalance in economic power between two Koreas led to imbalance in the military sector. Because they did not have enough gasoline, for example, they could not have as frequent drills as they wished. And actually this kind of problem led to the weakening of conventional weapons system in North Korea. Since they didn't have enough gasoline, they could not have their fighter planes flying over the sky of North Korea. And I still remember what I saw when in 2003. I once visited an underground bunker in which I could watch a radar screen which covers the whole sky of Korean Peninsula. At that time, in the south of DMZ, there were so many white dots moving from one place to another. All those airplanes, all those were airplanes flying over South Korea. But at the time, I saw just a few white dots moving north of DMZ. I mean, that clearly showed the lack of energy in North Korea. So this led to huge imbalance in the conventional military power. And actually, because of this, North Korean leader, I think, shifted their strategy to to one emphasizing the importance of asymmetrical or military forces, like developing nuclear power or chemical weapon system or biological weapon system or something like that. And the third imbalance, which I could find, was a diplomatic imbalance. South Korea opened diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union in 1990 and with China in 1992. On the other hand, North Korea wanted to open diplomatic relations with the United States in early post-Cold War period. For example, in January 1992, there was first high-level meeting between North Korea and the United States. And in that meeting, North Korean representative Kang Seok-ju actually suggested an idea of improving bilateral relationship between North Korea and the United States. But at that time, policymakers in the United States and South Korea were not ready to accept that kind of policy change suggested by North Korea. So North Koreans continue to be isolated from the international society. So there were this kind of three different types of imbalance between the North and the South. And North Korean political leaders, I think, came to have severe insecurity complex in their minds. They also, witnessed the collapse of the Eastern European communist countries. For example, they also witnessed the unification of Germany, absorption of East Germany into West Germany. So, in addition to this kind of important change in international situation, and they faced this kind of huge imbalance between in powers with South Korea. So it was natural for them to have serious insecurity complex in their minds. I think that was the reason why North Korean leaders decided to stick to the strategy of developing nuclear weapons. Of course, North Korean leaders were very much interested in developing nuclear power long time before 1994, 1993, when there was the first round of nuclear crisis. But I think this kind of change in the international situation and this kind of huge imbalance in powers between the North and the South contributed much to their decision to stick to the nuclear development strategy. And nuclear program for North Korean leaders was a very important instrument for dual purpose. On the one hand, they wanted to use nuclear development program as a guarantee of their own national security. And on the other hand, they also wanted to use this nuclear development program as a bargaining chip to extract economic and political benefits from the United States and South Korea and the Western world. The first round of nuclear crisis occurred sometime in 1993 and 1994. Of course, nuclear site was discovered by satellite U.S. satellite before 1993 or 1994. But these 2 years, 1993 and 1994, were a time of climax of first nuclear crisis on the Korean Peninsula. North Koreans tried to develop nuclear weapons through extracting plutonium, and they built a nuclear plant in Yongbyon area, probably 1 hour drive to the northwest from Pyongyang, not far from Pyongyang. And there were certainly, confrontations developing between North Korea on the one hand and international society on the other, because North Korea was the member of Non-Proliferation Treaty. They naturally had the obligation to receive inspection by IAEA. But North Koreans tried to hide their secret nuclear facilities in one way or another, and that caused some serious concern of IAEA and international society. And this intensifying crisis led to U.S. decision makers seriously considering the surgical strike of Yongbyon nuclear facility in May 1994, and that was a very serious crisis situation, though not many Koreans at that time recognized the seriousness of the crisis. So it was very tense, and if you read a book written by Don Oberdorfer, a former reporter of Washington Post, the title of that book was Two Koreas. I think that book is a very well-written record of nuclear crisis at this time. And according to him, almost every high-level officers and U.S. Army were recognized the imminent military confrontation with North Korea. So it was a very tense situation, and it was at that time when former President Jimmy Carter intervened. And he visited North Korea and mediated between the United States and North Korea. And it was a successful effort by President Carter. And this led to the settlement of the crisis. And there were Geneva Agreed framework concluded between North Korea and the United States in October 1994. The key contents of Geneva Agreed framework of 1994 was first, North Korea was supposed to freeze nuclear facilities in Yongbyon area. In return, the United States and other countries were supposed to provide North Korea with 2 nuclear light water reactors, which were regarded less dangerous. And to build and provide nuclear light water reactors, there was an institution called Korea Energy Development Organization, KEDO, was established. And Japan, South Korea, and European countries joined this institution, and they contributed financial resources and they began to build light water reactors in North Korea. And the U.S. Government also promised to provide the North Korea to provide with 500,000 tons of heavy fuel oil every year until light water reactors are built. And another important content was that by two countries, the United States and North Korea, promised to improve their mutual relations. So these were the basic agreement between two parties. And since the conclusion of agreed framework in October 1994, nuclear issues were settled, and there was no further instabilities related to this nuclear issue for coming several years at least. But in 2002, nuclear issue has become again a major concern among members of international society, because in October 2002, Assistant Secretary James Kelly of the U.S. government visited Pyongyang, and he had first direct contacts with North Korean representative since the beginning of the Bush administration. And in that meeting, North Korean representative admitted the existence of uranium enrichment program, and that marked the beginning of the second round of nuclear crisis. And this second round of nuclear crisis has not yet been solved. At that time, Bush administration took a multilateral approach in order to resolve this nuclear problem. It was a good contrast to Clinton administration's bilateral approach. President Bush and his team of foreign policy makers regarded that Clinton administration was naive in dealing with North Korea bilaterally. And they thought that once North Korea violates the agreement, there was no way, there was nothing the U.S. side could do. So this time, President Bush and his advisors thought that it would be better strategy began since in 2003, and the problem was that there was no progress in nuclear negotiation until late 2006. North Koreans' intransigence was a factor of no progress. Also, the U.S. government was firm in its belief that they cannot reward the bad behavior of North Koreans. But in late 2006, there was a shift of U.S. policy in dealing with North Korean nuclear problem. And for the first time, President Bush permitted the U.S. representative, Assistant Secretary Christopher Hill, to contact a North Korean representative on a bilateral basis. They met in Berlin, and they talked with each other more than several hours on this issue. And the U.S. And North Korean representatives, each side decided to cooperate. And the U.S. side, I think, promised to the North Korean side that they would lift financial sanction, which was working at that time. And in return, North Koreans promised to return to six-party talks. And that was the reason why there was a resumption of six-party talks in February 2007. And February 2007, six-party talks was an important talk because they could make a February 13th agreement on denuclearization of North Korea. They decided that to denuclearize North Korean nuclear facilities with three stages. And the first stage was making North Korean nuclear facilities inoperable. And the second stage, North Koreans were supposed to report every nuclear materials, and they were supposed to receive verification of what they reported. And the third phase was dismantlement of nuclear facility. But there was a deadlock in the second phase, and North Korea resisted deep verification of nuclear facilities in one way or another. And there was no progress in negotiation until the beginning of the Obama administration in 2009. So almost 1 year delay or deadlock in a nuclear negotiation. And when President Obama, Mr. Obama was elected as the President of the United States in November 2008, many people and specialists expected that North Korean nuclear issue would be able to be resolved in one way or another, because President Obama declared that he would be willing to meet even the leaders of rogue states, for example, including probably Kim Jong-il. And his philosophy in terms of dealing with global affairs was very different from President Bush's. He emphasized the importance of negotiation on this kind of issues, and he also emphasized a pragmatic approach. But this time, North Korean authority preempted by provoking, by making serious provocations in the spring of 2009. For example, they tested their nuclear weapons for the second time, and they launched missiles and a rocket. All these were violation of UN Security Council Resolution 1718. And since this provocation, there was no other choice for South Korean government and the US government to sanction North Koreans. So there was additional UN Security Council-led economic sanction against North Korea, according to UN Security Council Resolution of 1874. Actually, North Korea didn't give any other alternative, policy alternatives to the US as well as South Korea. When North Korea made this kind of serious provocation, no government would think that non-government policymakers would think that they would meet North Koreans and talk with them, North Koreans. So North Koreans were pushed through these economic sanctions. But in the summer, just a few months after the economic sanction of 1874, North Koreans began to change their diplomatic strategy toward smile diplomacy. I mean, they have become very nice to the United States and South Korea. For example, they set free 2 American reporters who crossed frontier and entered North Korean territory. They also freed South Korean worker who has some problems with North Korean authority in Kaesong area. And those North Koreans began to push 2 countries, the U.S. and South Korea, by saying that North Koreans are ready to talk and talk with both countries. But both the U.S. and South Korea responded to North Korean smile diplomacy with continued sanctions while leaving the door open for possible conversational talks with North Korea. I think it's a real dilemma. I mean, in retrospect, North Korean dilemma, nuclear dilemma, has become much more complicated than before. It was much worsened by North Koreans. For example, in October 2010, last year, just several months ago, the North Korean government invited U.S. nuclear scientist Dr. Siegfried Hecker, a professor at Stanford University, to the site of North Korean new uranium enrichment plant. And this made denuclearization issue even more complicated because, as you know, uranium facilities are very difficult to find and to locate. You can disperse all these facilities to various parts of the North Korean territory, and it is almost impossible to locate where those uranium facilities are. So it made the inspection or verification issue much more complicated and difficult. When North Koreans focused on plutonium project, it was relatively easy to find a nuclear plant. There was not much difficulties at that time, but this is totally different issue. Uranium project is a very different issue. And so how to deal with this uranium project is very complicated issue. And if six-party talks are resumed sooner or later, how to deal with this enriched uranium project will be a major topic for discussion. And I think if six-party talks resumes, I think probably the framework of discussion itself should be changed. And how to change the framework of negotiation, that is not yet decided. And there is another complicated issue, the issue of nuclear technology transfer. North Koreans were involved in building a secret nuclear plant in Syria several years ago. In September 2007, Israeli forces attacked Syria's secret nuclear facility, and at that time it was known that North Korean authorities transferred nuclear technology to Syria. So how to prevent this kind of behavior in the future? That will be another complicated issue for negotiators in the six-party talks. So unfortunately, there is not much hope for an immediate solution of this nuclear problem. And I think this is a big dilemma for policymakers of the US government, South Korean government, and Japanese government, or the members of six-party talks. And how to settle a permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula, that's another important subject. And as a concluding remark, I'd like to point out a few things. First of all, I cannot emphasize the importance of alliance relationship between the United States and South Korea too much. I think this is very important basis for building peace on the Korean Peninsula in the future. I think the United States should be a partner, important partner in building peace on the Korean Peninsula in the future. So I think the role of alliance in future peace settlement on the Korean Peninsula will be very important. Regarding how to deal with North Korea from South Korean point of view, I think we need some kind of engagement policy. The reason why I say this is because I think the North Korean problem itself has been caused by isolation of North Korea from international society. Since they are isolated from international society, North Korean leaders could easily control North Korean people. And North Korean people, since they were isolated, they could not know what is going on in the outside world. So we have to change the nature of North Korean society and North Korean regime through engagement. What I'm saying about engagement is that we need to make more opportunities for ordinary North Korean people to contact with outside world. In that way, we can make more linkages and channels of contacts between North Korean people and outside world. In that way, we can change the mindset of North Korean people, and we can help them to have better and more correct idea about what is going on in the outside world. So, in the long run, the change of perception and thinking of North Korean people will work as a kind of stimulus or even as pressure to North Korean leaders, so that North Korean leaders can adopt policies which will correspond to international norms, such as market principle or respect for human rights of North Korean people and denuclearization or something like that. So it is important to engage North Koreans, but it is also important to have a principle like that. I mean, inducing and inviting North Koreans to reform and open their social and economic system gradually. So it is important to try to resolve nuclear issue, but I think we don't have to develop this long-term policy tool which will be useful in changing the nature of North Korean society. So how to harmonize these two different tools, I think that's an important issue. In other words, engaging North Korea and keeping principle and pressuring North Korea to reform and opening. How to harmonize those two goals at the same time will be a very important task for governments in South Korea. Of course, this will not be easy. If you too rigidly emphasize the aspect of principle, probably the connection between the North and the South itself will be cut. And if you engage North Koreans without some kind of important principles, that will please North Korean leaders, but you will not be able to change the nature of North Korean regime. So that's my concluding remark, and I would like to stop here. Thank you very much for listening to my speech.